as you know, Sweden is a very consensus-oriented country. If you want the cultural equivalent, I think like Minnesota would be a good example of this. But the point is that it's only, from our perspective at least, possible to bring in new political language if you talk with people from abroad. But similarly, Sweden, in some respects, is a canary in the coal mine, which would make it relevant also to discuss what's happening here in relation to, well, the work that you're doing. So we're trying to move back and forth between both of these worlds.
That's very cool. What's fascinating to me, and I don't have enough knowledge here to really make solid arguments one way or another, is just the history of Scandinavian socialism, or so-called socialism, where I think it's probably fluctuated in terms of the involvement of the state in certain industries, or the amount of subsidies, or transfer payments, and so on. But from the perspective of the American left, Scandinavia is always held up as this, the paragon of socialism, whereas, of course, they don't want to talk about places like Cuba or anywhere like that. So it would be interesting to hear from you what your perspective is on that. Is the U.S. left's perspective totally deranged when it comes to their understanding of Scandinavian socialism, or is it fair? I don't know.
No, I mean, happy to get back into that conversation. Before we kick it off, as I mentioned, we're not doing a review of your book or your work.
Yeah, sure.
But more like using it as a starting point, the premise for the conversation, essentially. And so we'll try to get in briefly, like who you are, and sort of an assumption that, like, building on the assumption that the paper built is on fire. So you'll be able to describe more in detail what that means. Kalle, do you want to kick this off now?
Sure. I mean, we're very glad to have you, Michael. I have to say, I mean, your sort of resume is one of the most interesting ones. I think we've had a lot of interesting people on the podcast, but I think like a philosopher who ends up in sort of venture capital or the world of sort of technology and venture capital is sort of a novel one. I think it could only happen in the 21st century, probably. You have this interesting career of pursuing a doctorate in philosophy in Oxford, and then sort of being, as many, I think, people who sort of gravitate towards this podcast has become, were disenchanted by what you saw. I think the quote you gave to Thiel once was that you entered the sanctum of academia and found it empty, or something like that. I find that striking myself, to be honest, and I think it resonates with a lot of people. But then you go to back to the States. You end up with the PayPal mafia. You end up working for Thiel. You end up doing this Thiel Foundation, where you basically are running this case study of or very live study, I'd say, of trying to break people free from the university system and set them on a course. You have interesting people there. You have Vitalik from Ethereum. You have a lot of interesting personalities. You sort of coach up, and then you sort of launch your own thing where you're doing with 1519 Foundation, right? And
17, yep.
17. Sorry, I'm
all good.
I'm allergic to the Lutheranness of my own country. So
Carl, you're thinking of the 1619 project, very different one from the one Michael.
No. I know that's not what they were going for. Reformation.
We came first.
Yeah, I mean. I have my issues with the Reformation as a project, and I think we'll sort of get back to that. That's an interesting sort of vector of attack. But and now you've written this book, and you're in the sort of dual worlds of capital and ideas, which is fascinating to I think both of us, and I think to our listeners, and that's why you're here. So you're very welcome, and thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's get straight into it. What is the paper belt, and why is it on fire?
So the paper belt refers to this region in America from Washington, D.C. up north, northeast to Boston, very dense with cities and industries and government. Sometimes people call it the I-95 corridor because of the highway there. But the paper belt, me and my friend Balaji Srinivasan, over 10 years ago now at this point, we were just riffing on ideas and sort of landed on this concept of the paper belt, which is that a lot of those industries and government bodies operate on paper. In Washington, they print laws on paper, money on paper, they print passports on paper, visas. And in Delaware, people incorporate on paper. In New York, somewhat symbolically, but the media is still, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal on paper, advertising. And then in Boston, you have the pinnacle of American higher education with Harvard and MIT, and they're printing diplomas on paper. So we were theorizing about the next coming wave of decentralized technology. At that time, Ethereum was just getting started. Bitcoin was getting its first legs, and we were hoping that some of these decentralizing technologies might obviate the need for these institutions in the paper belt. The shining example there, although not based on anything like a blockchain, was something like Uber or Lyft, where you had the old medallion issuing agencies in different cities to run taxi cabs, but Uber and Lyft showed that technology could provide a better solution, both in terms of customer experience, but also in terms of safety. These medallions are meant to be given out to people who pass background checks of one kind or another, but it was way safer to ride in an Uber. So yeah, we came up with this term, the paper belt, and the institutions within them. One thing that stands out in the sort of Satoshi Nakamoto analysis of institutions is that anything that is paper-based relies upon a centralized authority to authenticate and validate that piece of paper, to say that this thing is not counterfeit, this is real, and also that it signals something. So whether the Federal Reserve with dollars, their aim is to sort of chip away at the value of the dollar by inflating it slowly, but nevertheless preserve some of the medium of exchange and store of value, or the Harvard administration, authenticating that this degree someone has is real. And what the analysis showed, though, is like these centralized authorities, they are susceptible to corruption, drift, mission drift, and collusion inside. And so the paper belt on fire refers to the declining performance of these institutions over the last 30, 40 years. It's like we can no longer trust these people. Maybe they say it's a Harvard degree, but the worth of it is a lot less than it used to be. Okay,
so then using the allegory of paper here, is it fair to say that the certificates, it has sort of, higher education certificate has sort of become the new print money?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are governments and people who believe you can educate a country by just printing more diplomas. In the same way they think you can get rich by printing money in some strange way. I think that's true in the way these degrees have been watered down. Is they're able to sort of batch a whole graduating class together, and irrespective almost of the subject matter of study, we're supposed to take these degrees as signaling something about their holder. I think that has, people are getting wise to this, including employers now. So there does seem to be something off about the signaling power of those pieces of paper.
I'm sure this is something we're going to come back to, but you're alluding in like the 1517 fund that you're running, and obviously reference to the Protestant or Lutheran Reformation at the time. And Calle's point, bringing this up earlier, I would like to read one quote that I found striking from your book, Paper Belt of Fire, where a joke, that is you and Thiel and the others, we're a joke, but a dangerous one, a joke that throws authority into panic. Decaying corrupt institutions, not just higher education, but the media, publishers, think tanks, nonprofits, city halls, and other government bureaucracies, are crumbling all around us. They're no longer trustworthy, they're failing to achieve their stated purposes, and once challenged, rather than reform, the paper belt elite tend to offer only self-serving denials and contempt. So why is this? Why this deferral to self-serving denials and contempt?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. I think part of it is psychosocial, in the sense of like these elite want to maintain their position in the commanding heights of society. And so they're going to do whatever they can in order to maintain that power. But what's difficult is that the declining performance is becoming more and more transparent over time. I just think of like the 2016 election. It felt like after Trump was elected, there was like 2 months when the mainstream media said, "Oh, wow, we don't know what the troubles of inner America are, or the heartland of America. We should go out there and learn more about the American farmer or the American manufacturer." And they did that for like 2 months. And then after that, they were like, "No, we just hate these people." So I think there was something like that where they just felt it was beneath them. Uh, I guess it's almost like if they acknowledge the declining performance, then they have to acknowledge their responsibility in it. So
can I ask you here?
I don't have a good theory about that.
But given what Carl began discussing your own background and why we think it's relevant to speak with you, given how you've been in these institutions, then left and tried to build something different, an alternative. Like, what were you doing back in 2016 when this happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, we felt we had our own version of that contempt and ridicule. So with the Thiel Fellowship, which I see as this outside path of the standard route to, let's say, a fulfilling career in the U.S., where it's just this monolithic culture that everyone has to go to a school of higher education. If you don't, you're a dunce. So we were running this program, and right from the start, we received ridicule and contempt. Jacob Weisberg in Newsweek, and 2 weeks after we launched the thing, was ridiculing us, saying we were creating the NBA for white men, which is so ridiculous. And then Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, Treasury Secretary, quote, it's my favorite quote, is he said we were the most misdirected philanthropy of the decade. So these are establishment types, and why would they care what we were doing with 20 people? I mean, it's outrageous. It's but they were threatened, because I think on the one hand, they did understand that there were cracks in the foundations of their institutions, but on the other hand, they still felt they had the power to ostracize us or make us look ridiculous. So I think by 2016, so that started in 2010. By 2016, I had seen that in education. So if I saw it in other domains of American life, I was not surprised at all. I think we certainly saw it in the media with just the media's challenge to being the sole source of information and authority on things. The contempt they had for bloggers, podcasters, I mean, that carries on to this day.
I think it's interesting, just to harken back to the Reformation sort of analogy here, because I think it's usually on top of people's minds when it comes to these sort of reforming moments, because you always have the analogy of we live in a digital age. Obviously, Luther was sort of dependent on Gutenberg's technology to spread his message. And I think, interestingly enough, I think the Lutherans are one of the first people who actually used negative campaigning in comic strips to just get, so basically like memes. They were doing memes on the Catholic Church. And it sort of caught on, and everyone thought it was funny. And
Luther was an absolute shit poster.
Yeah, I was going to say he was the king shit poster.
Yeah, and also
the master of the listicle.
and like the typical sort of autistic academic in that sense of even the fabricated story of him. Obviously, he did the thesis posting on the wall, but everyone did, so it was like a big thing. But I think like the interesting part with that analogy for me is like he lived in this. We think of it maybe as like an authoritarian time, but it was a very splintered time, because you had all these European states, especially in the empire where he lived. I mean, you have these different princes who could sort of, he obviously he got where like he was protected by sort of these different rivaling institutions. And I think like the difference now, and I think this is why this moment is sort of very poignant and very, difficult for a lot of people, that it feels very much like we're in a much more difficult spot, even though we have these, you referenced, decentralized technology. And I think everyone's sort of lived in the last 10 years have sort of seen that hope go up like a balloon and then sort of they're slowly falling from it and becoming very, very, sad about all those hopes and promises of an open internet and what that sort of movement was supposed to represent. And now I think, especially after COVID, I think a lot of us are in this sort of position of saying, well, okay, but where's this change where we're going to have, and aren't we up against a harder and a more monolithic force in a sense than Luther was up against in his time? And you don't really have that other power you could go to host your ideas, to have this sort of institutional competition or whatever. And so I think, even as a Swede, we have the same problems in academia. You can basically copy paste, I think, all over sort of Anglophone, and I'll count us in here because most of the sort of sophisticated research is obviously done in English. So hence the theory comes to us downstream very, very fast. And we have the same problems with different institutions that you guys have. And the Brits, as you know, have the same sort of ill.
Yep. Yeah, I think the promise of decentralization is very much an open question still, and there are so many other centralizing forces. I am surprised at how authoritarian nations became under COVID. That in some ways I shouldn't be surprised, but given the fact that I somewhat complied with some of the dumb regulations that were and restrictions that were put on all of us, it does make me wonder, just how weak some of these more freedom-loving movements could be. But on the other hand, and maybe it's like never again. It's like we went through that, and I think I think they'd be hard put. It would be very difficult for even the American government to put the same restrictions on the people that they had during the lockdown. But I agree with you. I think it's still an open question, and which means it's upon all of us to keep fighting the fight.
Another point here on in what ways the paper belt is on fire. You describe later on in the book this sort of you put together or juxtapose different catastrophes, and at some point it hits home that there's a widening chasm between, on the one hand, the stated purpose of what this institution is supposed to do, or what this government is supposed to be, and then its actual performance. And one thing we have been discussing earlier on the Manifesto podcast is sort of, Carl mentioned that we do come from like outliers in the political spectrum, like libertarian in his respect, Marxism in mine. But there is an interesting convergence at the moment where liberalism and liberal democracy seems to have a similar way of coping with the system not delivering, similarly to how socialistic states dealt with this being, real socialism. This was what socialism actually became. And now there's dawning upon us, I think only some week ago, that what's his name? This British historian who's married to Somali
Neil Ferguson.
Dutch. Yes,
Ferguson, yeah.
Neil Ferguson wrote, "We're all Soviets now."
Right.
Essentially, that we reached a point where liberalism becomes real liberalism, and whatever, and then you have, perhaps for natural reasons, and this is not just taking a piss of liberalism or libertarianism, but I'm not surprised that libertarianism is on the rise as a way for people who are criticizing the system, but their go-to language is, this is not genuine liberalism. But it seems to be in the similar situation where people who were critical of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, who would still consider themselves socialists, would still not have the new language to describe what was about to come. You follow the allegory that I'm trying to...
I think the parallel is there. So in the same way that socialists cope by saying that real socialism hasn't been tried yet, So you can't compare my ideals to Cuba and so on. So too does the Western liberal say, or even libertarians say, the examples we see in the United States and elsewhere, these states are crumbling or in decline, but this is not true liberalism. Um, the difference there, I would say, is this, though, is that we do have a historical track record of how nations perform under different laws and institutions. And in the United States in particular, it did used to be a more dynamic place under a different set of rules, in particular from, let's say, the end of the Civil War to the First World War, something like that. So it's like, more libertarian policies have been tried. And I think they have shown success. So it's not quite a good parallel. But on the other hand, I think there is something important to acknowledge, which is that the other side on these debates is not going away. So it's like if you passed your favorite policies tomorrow, the other side is gonna vote in the next election. They're still gonna keep throwing up candidates and so on. And I think any political philosophy, at least in terms of the realism, is like if you're not acknowledging that, then your head is in the clouds and you're too idealistic. So there is something where we're Siamese twins joined at the hips in terms of ideologies, is like the socialists, the progressives, the anti-racists, we're joined at the hips with the libertarians and the conservatives, and we can't get away from each other. So therefore, it's like whatever we do together is going to always have some drop or admixture of something we don't like. Unless there are other options. I mean, we could talk startup cities and charter cities and so on. But I think in terms of like if you're going to stay in the United States or the UK or Sweden, I don't know, but it's like, okay, you're going to have to acknowledge that the Siamese twin problem.
One of the problems, I think, with the sort of new system, same as the old system analogy is, I mean, yes, I sort of agree with the fact that we'll sort of have to, if you're not talking about like full on revolution or something else, the system has to be managed in a sort of way. But I think the problem are there are a few problems that are sort of never happened before, and one is the sort of institutional dominance from the left. I think we've never seen since. I mean, even like in your country, the left, everyone really likes to talk about the McCarthy years, but like the sort of we haven't seen lawfare on this sort of scale since. Probably the Civil War in your case, or maybe the First War. Like you had the Alien and Sedition Act being used for the first time, I think, in the World War I or something like that. That was sort of lines kept getting crossed, and I think like we're on. I think the sort of the late Roman Republic analogy is a bit tired, to be honest. But there's a few like interesting things there, because you have this sort of cycle of violence or cycle of sort of you have Sulla and Marius, and they go back and forth and back and forth, and this sort of destabilizes the system in the sense of not like that they actually change maybe that many radical laws or whatever, but people get desensitized towards like political violence or putting your enemies in jail, or sort of the spoils system. And I think we're in a place both in Europe and in the US where politicians are getting, and especially like I'd say old school, more mainstream politicians from the old center sort of left spectrum, are getting very, very afraid that if they don't become authoritarian, like for instance, you can see Trudeau did this turn very much in Canada. If you don't like use the system, the power of the system against your political enemies, sort of really bad things will happen. And you have these, Nazi analogies, but there is a moment here I think we haven't seen in politics.
You're right. There's an intensity. Each side treats every election as if it's the live or die moment for the nation. That if we don't win, then American democracy is over, or so it does feel like the stakes are so high on either side, and we could debate like why that's the case, but the polarization is real. I think you're spot on about that.
This is the sort of where we need your insight, so to speak, right? Because the discussions me and Jonas tend to have with our guests are basically how do we present an alternative to maybe like the struggle in a sense, but like is there, because I think a lot of this sort of anger from let's use the right just to have a thing to call the mass of people that sort of vote for largely right-wing, largely populist parties all over the Western world right now. But I think the sort of problem there is they're not people in command of these paper institutions, right? They're being despised by the people with the paper diplomas and money and whatnot because they're plebs.
Yeah.
And as with the late Roman Republic again, I mean, every champion you sort of send forth from the plebs, you sort of get mercilessly slaughtered, you know. And I think like Trump is an interesting like guy in this sense that, yeah, of course, like he won the first election, right? But then like his presidency was basically allegations of being a foreign agent and whatnot, and like all these sort of scandals that I think, whatever, like you might not even be on the side of the spectrum of people who think that everything against him or most of the things against him was made up, but like the feeling of people were on his side obviously is going to be that the sort of presidency
I think
was
you're
stolen.
spot on. I mean, there's only so much a president can do. I think the power of the deep state was in full force in 2016. I'm fully on board with the Russia hoax and the efforts to discredit Trump. I mean, even the more mild case of Hunter Biden's laptop, where I believe it was October 2020, and you have 50 members of high-ranking members of the U.S. intelligence community issuing a statement saying that the laptop was a part of Russian disinformation plot, when I'm sure some of them knew better. I mean, this is outrageous. This just goes to show, one, that they want to discredit the president, but number two, just how corrupt that institution is. Just line up the CIA and some of the other agencies as like one of these examples of failures in the paper belt. You're right. It does have a decadent Roman feel to it. I have a contrarian view on Rome where, it's almost like the creativity of Rome died with the fall of the Republic, even though the empire lived on technically another 400 years or so. And there are lots of Roman stands who want to talk about Marcus Aurelius and so on, but like, man, the dynamism of Rome had faded by then. They were more or less just a powerful imperial state at that point. But when you look at the arts, the poetry, the theater, you look at the science, is like they had not really made advances for 400 years. So to me, that shows like there's this term Adam Smith had, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. And what that means is sometimes it does take or what is it, Hemingway about bankruptcy? It's like gradually and then suddenly. Exactly. But like the phase transition happened earlier. In the case of Rome, I think, where the fading of the Republic into the empire meant that, the creative spark had died. And I don't know, could they have turned it around, or was it just so dysfunctional? And so, because the stakes were so high and because it was so powerful, and maybe the U.S. is similar in that sense, is like maybe the golden age of creativity and dynamism has passed, but the U.S. still has, some, maybe even a century to go before the lights go out completely.
But so this is my very European sort of view on this, and I think it's very interesting because I think you in the U.S. Have the sort of, with your federalist system, very much sort of in favor of this, and I think instinctually sort of like the sort of competing institutions, competing states, or the laboratories of democracy, or whatnot. And I think like this is the thing with Europe, right? Like you have all these sort of amalgamations of empire in the European history, and you have Napoleon, you have the imperial sort of Habsburg Empire and whatnot, but you have all these splinters from it, and from this sort of chaos comes the sort of dynamism, and I mean, whether you like it or not, these people who can't publish in France are going to go to Switzerland or some of the Italian states, and you have these competing interests. And I think now you have a federal government that's very much overbearing and sort of stifles innovation in its sense, and we have our own federal system. That's the European Union might not be like have the sort of federalist powers yet that the U.S. federal state has, but still you have we're supposed to be making our last internal combustion engine in 2035. They now decided. So I mean, and this is real. Like this isn't just like some like the Brits like to say it's only Brussels. Yeah, I mean, but it affects you. So this is one of the problems of the West, that it's very much and it's been made. Farage makes the point about the USSR analogy to the EU all the time, but I think like there's a real thing in this, that sort of empire has this sort of centralizing and very stifling effect.
Yeah. You can see it in the economic data now, where it's so clear that Europe is falling behind America in terms of real GDP per capita.
Yeah.
And I think it's a direct result of the stifling bureaucratic empire from Brussels. I do think Europe had greater, more interesting cultures, but also greater dynamism in a time when those borders had more meaning to them. Maybe there was loss in terms of market sizing on trade, but and in terms of like the creative output of what we consider Western Europe, it was just really astonishing from 1500 to World War I, let's say. I touch on that in my book. I think there's great danger in the view of empire as universal rules across all countries. And the reason that's the case is that it just gives the greater chance of totalitarian capture. Where are you going to go? You can't try new ideas. You mentioned in the old days in Europe how scientists and artists and philosophers could move from one country to the next if their ideas weren't accepted, and so if we're all under the one world government, or these competing EU and so on, it's like, where are you going to go if you're a unorthodox thinker or builder? It's like you might find yourself trapped. So I'm very sensitive to those types of things, and to that end, maybe Brexit was a good thing.
Yeah,
yes, go ahead.
No, but like I think this is sort of what both me and Johan are sort of pining for, somebody to tell us like how to build like what's the underground railroad, what's the Samizdat, what's the come on, we need something here.
Right. Does that make me Uncle Tom? What are you going after, Colin? What we're talking about?
Yes, probably, Johan. You are. If somebody's Uncle Tom on this podcast, it should be
Harriet
Beecher. Yeah, and I'll be. Well, let's not pursue this allegory bit, but like, So this, I think this is the rival institution, this sort of rival castle, here is. A thing that interests me is sort of a conundrum for me, because like, are you going to go like, say, the Gramscian route that we always say that our enemies have gone, long march towards through the institutions?
Yeah, sorry, Carl, could you unpack that just so we actually understand how to approach this question?
I think everyone is listening. Okay, so maybe not everyone is listening knows Antonio Gramsci, but basically, he was an Italian Marxist. He was in President under Mussolini, and his major contribution is like, he really thought hard and long about cultural hegemony and that sort of the hegemon of the culture and the sort of prevailing philosophy and thoughts and things were the things that shaped society and would sort of pave the way for, in his case, Marxism. And this is, I think in the U.S., Andrew Breitbart did this. Culture. What is it? Society is downstream from culture. And this, but this sort of analogy of that you need really, like, you can, if you want to know why things are happening, you just look into culture. But the problem with us sort of right-wingers, libertarians, whatnot, is that we don't have the cultural cachet of the Marxists that they had from the 50s and onwards. They were always sort of a popular.
Yeah.
And so see, and this goes for progressive ideology, and I think, like, in just a sense of them being forward looking. So this is a problem we have if we want to do the same strategy they did. And the alternative strategy is, some people say, well, found your own universities. Well, in the US, that's semi-doable. But
right.
where a country, most universities, if not everyone, is public funded. That's sort of the hard proposition, I think.
Right.
So then either people say you're going to do like Orbanist sort of. The problem is that you have to have a base for this. So this is the problem we're into. Right?
Yeah,
we're
college was easy as a target in a way. We just had to show in the United States that there was some small group of really interesting people who didn't need it. The counter argument back then, it used to be against the Thiel Fellowship. The first arguments were that it would never work, that this was crazy. But now, 14 years later, and given the examples that people have set forth, now the argument is, well, this is all well and good for maybe 500 people, but this is, how do you go from 500 to 10,000? I still think we can go there, but at least we have this beachhead, and I think there's something in the United States now where the entrepreneur is very much a public figure, charismatic in some ways and vilified in others. And if I think of like the leading thinkers on the right in the United States, they're actually people now like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. They're not philosophy professors or intellectuals writing for the public. Whereas on the left, I think that's still traditionally true. I would love, with 1517, we've been backing people without degrees to establish them as examples who, here's a fulfilling career without college. I would love to try to experiment in different domains. We have a financial model that works with venture capital, but I don't know with these other cultural domains. And I want to experiment in the next couple of years, I think, when I have more resources, because we can't do it within 1517, but maybe we set up something else. And on this point, one idea I have is, I'm going to tour America for like 6 months to a year to just find like the best 10 or so young comedians. And then if I have the money, maybe I can like propose to them like, hey, have you ever thought writing a play? Have you ever thought, maybe we could try writing a pilot episode of something? And the idea I have there is like comedians right now are like the conscience of America. It's like they're the last refuge of like funny free speech. And because they often live these weird, eclectic, eccentric lives outside of college and so on, like maybe they're so far out of indoctrination that by supporting them, maybe we can get a little bit of that cool factor that you're talking about, the renegades outside of the usual institutions. So that's like an example of an experiment I think I'd love to run over the next few years. Other domains in America, like people don't read novels as much as maybe in Europe. So I don't know if it's worth trying to find the next great novelist out there outside of universities, but I do think it is worth trying these experiments in general.
I mean, the case study for that, sort of the shining example would be Joe Rogan, right? Like the guy who's like,
right.
Like you even have the sort of UFC Trump connection there, which is hilarious. I think
I know, right?
It's so funny that all these sort of pieces come together.
But even guys on the left like Dave Chappelle, it's like even they are bumping up against the countercurrent of wokeism and anti-racism and so on, which is crazy.
But on this point, I think when Carl brought up Gramsci and hegemony, I think what would be interesting to see your take on here is whether or not, I mean, one way is say like, well, the commanding heights have been occupied already. And then, of course, we can discuss whether or not you can retake them, which would be like, reform, or you build something entirely new, like you build your own mounts.
Yeah,
But
my bent is to say you have to build something entirely new. I bet you could reform it, but I think it's going to would take political action. I mean, it'd have to be, to go back to the Reformation, it would have to be the dissolution of the monasteries. You would have to have,
Exactly.
laws passed with cops coming in the Harvard yard telling these professors, hey, you're no longer allowed to teach here. I mean, it would be
so that's actually where I wanted to have you on, Michael, because this is the real value proposition of Sweden, that when you reform a country like Sweden, you tear down the monasteries, you confiscate the gold, and then you buy armies, and you use the Bibles written in Latin to pack the cannons and shoot it back at these people who are going to hell, and turning Germany into Syria under ISIS, basically. So this is you speak to the right people, but
it's not a bad. The ISIS analogy is not a bad analogy, by the way. Like ISIS are basically like the Protestants of
I mean, we come riding with beards on mooses and so let's.
I know. All right. So yes, we use the Protestant Reformation analogy, but I do agree with you. I think one of you alluded to this earlier that, there's something where Protestantism can be blamed for a lot of the pathologies on the left, because I think it is very much a Christianity without Christ, a atheist morality that is living on the vestiges of these Christian moral impulses that are very Protestant.
Yes, I think this is what makes this make sense. That this is the 500 end point since the Reformation, and we're realizing that all these contradictions can no longer fit together. Like these institutions no longer live up to the purpose. And I think looking at it from that perspective of these aeons of time, it seems more realistic to think of it in those terms, that it takes 500 years for the Reformation to really run its course. And then you actually have to come up with something else where the solutions might not be until centuries later.
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of the things that stands out to me are just like the intersection of Protestantism with the scientific revolution, Darwin, the death of God. I think there's something about that where in the West you see this degrading moral political view where it's like only and the counter example to compare it by is China, where in the US you would think with the death of God that people would then embark on a life of nihilism and hedonism. But instead what you see is you go from the nihilism of the 1860s in Russia to the communism of, hey, we're going to protect the oppressed and the worst off. It's like God is dead, therefore we need to protect the worst off. That doesn't make sense unless you have some, the vestiges of some Christian morality. Yeah. Whereas China, I think you don't see the same thing because even though they're atheists, they're not hindered or kept in check by these Christian impulses.
I think that's one of the most succinct points one can make in sort of and I think this is what a thing in sort of discourse today. This is a minor tangent, but I think it fits so well because you have all these people. You have Tom Holland who did the book Dominion, basically laying out the case for how Christian we really are, and that this should be studied even more and taken into account. But I think the China case is so succinct because here you have people say, well, basically all the religions are the same. Basically all people are the same. Well, are they? Before Christians entered, people always use the Gandhi quote of Gandhi saying, "What do you think about Christian civilization? I think it's a good idea." Yeah, well, he stole that basically from reading Christian scripture. Basically, he's critiquing the West in a Christian manner back to itself. But when the Brits sort of entered India and they were burning widows with their husbands, I mean. This is a different moral universe, and the people cannot see that the sort of decolonization discourse where you're going to have you have university students in South Africa going black witch magic is just as real as your crazy Western science. Right. This is where you end up. You end up with eugenics on the scale of China and cloning and all these things, and suddenly you're going to realize like the Catholic Church isn't as crazy as you thought it was.
Yeah.
Which is
well, back to
a
the
lot of
early, right. Back to Johan's point about 500-year time horizons. I mean, the other trend we haven't touched on is just the demographic collapse, the low fertility rates. And I think in the next 100, 200 years, it may be the case that there are no Western liberal people because they just stopped having kids. And, the only people who remain are in the United States, the Quakers and
Amish,
and the colonists.
and the colonists.
Yes.
All right. There you go. Right. In which case, right, is like that it just couldn't last. And so what are the I think whatever emerges, I think we need some re-enchantment of the world, and with that some new sense of the sacred. I mean, and maybe that does mean a return to the copybook gods, right? And maybe it is just a restoration of some Catholicism in some way, or Orthodox Christianity. I don't know, but there's a sense in which, at first with Protestants, it was, okay, you can't depict Christ on the crucifix. We need a bare crucifix. Now we need a bare church. It's like eliminating all the ornamentation, and then we eliminate God altogether. And what are you left with? But nothing that can continue.
And I think this is so succinct, because I think we in Sweden, we used to have a state church. It was officially abolished in 2000. But before that, there really was a state church, and I mean, same thing with the UK, because you have the monarchy and the sort of religion intertwined, right? Which is why it was, all the Protestant countries were founded, because the monarch really wanted it. But today we're in this hilarious situation of having report from the VP of finance of the Swedish church telling you how good the stock market is or something the other night.
Okay.
And then you have, priests saying that, God might be female. We don't know, probably is. And we have no problems with accepting Muslims as a member of our community. And you're like, yeah, of course you don't, because this is the logical endpoint. Like atheism is the logical endpoint of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, but I think there's something to that. There might be individual cases and little enclaves of devout people, but the overall trend just seems to be the disappearance of God.
I saw the Unitary Church had this conference in the US a couple months ago, and they were all using pronouns. They were all stepping up to the podium and announcing the podiums, and I'm like, this is the sort of what everyone in the sort of 10 years ago, everyone's going, these are the people with the Jefferson Bibles, right? Jefferson took a razor and cut out everything that's superstitious in the Bible.
Yes, yeah.
These are the legacy of the Enlightenment. These are the people, right?
But hold on, I think it's relevant to also point out, I'm not saying it's a contradiction, but it strikes me as superficially strange bedfellows. That on the one hand, then you have this recognition that there's what you said, Mike, there might be a need for Catholicism, and might be the fact that we don't even know how to describe why that would be preferable. But there's something that is more enchanted, let's put it like that. And I agree with that assessment. And when speaking with Peter when he was in Cambridge, this was very much close to the imagery of how he described what it was at play. Was one could have described it as esoteric. I think it's actually getting to the point of there needs to be an effortlessness in which you discuss things that at the moment seem esoteric or even magical. And I think he tries to broach that, and I find similar trace of that in the responses that you give. But it seems to me odd, and this is why I call it a contradiction to begin with, that on the one hand you have this magical or conservative outlook, we need to go further back. When we say 1517 fund, actually we sort of want, we're going even further back than that. Like the true, when we say we want to reform, we're actually going back to the true Catholic Church, But then on the other, you have this.
See the problem. Sorry to interrupt you, but the problem there is you're thinking like the thing you are again, Johan. You're thinking like a Protestant.
Yeah,
because
of course I am.
Would say,
of course I am.
But I just want to point it
leave
out.
my software alone. I'm going to finish the question.
Sorry, I just want to point it out to our listeners because like nobody who's serious about let's follow let's re-enchant the world. Like, and the first thing a Protestant would say, yeah, let's go back to the sources of something original and find what's true. No, sorry, no, we're not doing that.
Fine, fair point. But
we're staying with the eternal. We're staying with the eternal.
Okay, fine. But the other camp seems to me to be more, say, accelerationist. That is, you need to lean even further into modernity, more innovation.
Right.
There's to quote from or paraphrase one of these right-wing surfer dudes, Mike Ma, decelerate the tribe, accelerate the world. Like, why these two camps? Why are they coalescing in making a similar problem description? Do you buy into this description of these two, to me at least, contradictory forces seem to be grasping towards each other?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I mean, it is a really good point. I think there are just conservatives who, conservative is defined by, thinking the world, your country or the institution or whatever went off the rails. And so you're a conservative by what year you think it went off the rails. And maybe it is in 499 or 121. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's like the extreme libertarians who fit like the profile of like the Bay Area rationalist almost, who's just all about like accelerating at maximum speed because they want to upload their brain to the computer. When stated in that sense, they do feel like very different tribes, but they do have a common enemy in the woke and the progressive left, and so maybe that's what keeps them together to some extent. But in some ways, I do see a fusion, a synthesis in the two. It's like I study antiquity, but I do it in order to understand the future better. It's like it is part of that future. Like the real long-termism isn't about. I mean, maybe to some extent it has to be about thinking about future people and the risks they face and what we can do to help them. But on the other hand, it's also just about building institutions that last. And so one thing the Catholic Church has going for it is that it's been around for 2,000 plus years or so. Maybe a little less, I guess. But so it's like how if you do care, and we could debate is like, why is that important? Okay. But I do think understanding how to build institutions that last and serve their purpose for more than 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, I think that is a question that futurists and conservatives might align on.
When sort of, I think we all grew up, we had, were you a 1984 person? Or were you a Brave New World person? And I was always like an Orwell guy because it was easier to understand. There was a movie, it was pretty good about it. But like, I think the older I get, the more sort of Brave New World I become. Like, right? Like the sort of cry from the savage at the end is. We're like the main character, like he's like, no, I want God, I want freedom, I want all these things. I don't want to be programmed. I don't want to be like in this, like virtual sort of mindscape all the time. And I think like it's pretty crazy that we sort of ended up on Catholicism because I wasn't going to take us there, if not for Yuan. But like it's interesting because when you sort of survey the landscape, you have all these people like you mentioned Neil Ferguson. His wife just became Christian, right? Like she used to be this atheist icon, Ian Hersey. And you have people like Peterson talking more and more about religion and writing a book on it now. Right. Basically, also this sort of reevaluation of the Enlightenment and what it was, and the Reformation and what it was, and sort of the cultural legacy we have with us today. Because I really think like we myself, I was really brought up on this sort of Max Weberian paradigm of Protestant countries were these, the most dynamic countries. And we did this because of our sort of culture, and it stayed with us and made us successful. Yes, but it also made us like susceptible to the most sort of potent versions of the mind virus. And I don't, for some reason, see this in the Southern European countries as much as I do in the Protestant North. And it's telling me something. Like, I don't know why, but it's telling me something.
Yeah. One thing you said, I mean, it's somewhat tangential, is it's almost like as though I think we need to become more ad hominem in our attacks on certain ideologies and philosophies. And what I mean by that is, what does it look like to live by these philosophies? What do these people turn into? And independently of the content of their arguments and the logic of their reason, is what does it mean to live by these philosophies? In that sense, maybe it's not ad hominem, but more like Dostoevsky, right? Where in a novel of ideas, each character represents what it means to live by a certain philosophy. And so it's like if I think of a Bay Area rationalist who wants to upload his mind or live forever in some weird sense, it's like they just look like, these are lives that don't look like they're worth living. I mean, SBF is almost a comical exaggeration.
Yeah, exactly.
And whereas or even just like the standard secular atheist liberal type, that life seems very poor in a moral spiritual sense. And so I wonder if like the real test of these philosophies will be like, what sort of men and women do they produce in the long run?
Yeah, and as you said, I think we can make it about, it's sort of obviously reductive, but like the demographic argument here is not worthless, because like you have it's actually interesting. You have, I mean, Orban is the case, but I think you have all these politicians in Southern Europe now going around saying, this is the major problem we're not talking about. I mean, Elon Musk has been on this ball for a long time and tooting the horn, but I mean, me and Johan are from the country of Greta, and the sort of ideology here is like the earth is full. The only problem we have is how do we move people from the global south to the global north for some reason. We don't know why, but like we know that we shouldn't have babies because that's it's basically the same argument you used to have about nukes and is cruel to bring children into a world is going to end. It's basically that logic, but it's now sanctioned by everyone from your local church to.
Yeah, this is good. I'm going to circle back to something else you said earlier about like the Gramsci analysis of power and hierarchy. Is that I think there was this flip that occurred, at least in America now, on these issues, where in the 1950s, say, the conservative establishment was very much the man in the gray flannel suit, the organization man, very just like everyone lives the same life. They buy the same house in the suburb. They remember everyone's birthday and everyone has the same car and so on. And then the counterculture at that time was the beat poets, the hippies, the jazz musicians and so on. And then at some point in the 70s, let's say, that flips where now, and then intensified now, where it's like what was the counterculture then is now the establishment and the conservative force trying to preserve things. So it's like you have Greta, you have DEI. It's like they're requiring everyone to live by these rules. And what I've seen, at least in the United States, is like the counterculture among young men in particular, let's say 18 to 22, is now rebelling against that. So what does that mean? It's countercultural and cool to say, I love America. I want to have lots of kids. I'm going to have kids early. I think marriage is important. It's like these sorts of things now are starting to have a rebellious edge to them that I think they didn't have even 5 years ago. And that's been a fascinating turn of events that I've seen.
I think the most craziest thing, the sort of thing that really turned me on this sort of moral issue, is I read this quite liberal magazine in Sweden. It was interviewing like a 20-year-old like influencer feminist. She was she was having a conversation with this old like 1968 old school feminist, and they were talking about relations. And the young female was like, so the problem now is that everyone's like commoditized in all these apps and whatnot, and we got the short end of the stick of the sexual revolution, and this should be like very much revalued, but we should put it into the fantasy that this was a good thing for women. Right. And then 1968 feminist is like all up in flames. It's like, what are you talking about? This is the best. This is the only thing. This is the major struggle of my life. I haven't done anything else than like be a proponent of this. She goes like, what do you want? Do you want like no sex before marriage? And the girl goes, yeah, maybe that's the solution.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is Stockholm.
That's a great example. That's the counterculture, right?
This is like person on like the campus of Berkeley saying like, no, let's be Mormon or something.
Yeah,
like
right.
It's fantastic, and I'm like, we're really on to something right now, because I think like for all the the Me Too movement was not only a movement of the sort of angst of females and like the sort of woke moment of females, but it was also sort of a you could say conservative rebellion against the sort of sexual mores of her time. Yeah. And this hasn't been picked up, I think, enough by people who would be sort of open to this, but there are some people who are really good on this. And
right.
This is one of the tangents to sort of inform me on that we need to, again, I mean, and what does she want? Well, she wants resacralization of sexual relations. That's what she wants.
Right.
And it makes sense as a female to want that for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of now where collected over the last 40, 50 years, like it's clear that some people have not been living the life that they maybe truly deep down really wanted to live, and they're miserable because of it. Or maybe they were like influenced by the hopes of feminism, and now they find themselves less happy than they might have been. And so maybe on a personal level, we will start to see people track towards it. You're right. In the US, there's a little bit of this happening too. I think there are camps now of increasing number of women saying the sexual revolution has to be reevaluated, and it's not just right wingers.
What a hell of a time to be alive in! It's sort of shocking, because I was this sort of shrilling Dawkins atheist when I was in college,
right?
And from our sort of my cultural background or our cultural background, even thinking in this sort of terms would not make sense. But here we are. Maybe the counterculture is what we're craving and what we should support, right? Like, building these sort of alternative institutions and magazines that used to be driving this and the sort of cultural expressions. I think they're there
right.
too.
I do think there might be a business opportunity in starting a women's magazine that is for smart women on these things. It's like the counter to like Vogue or Vanity Fair, but
that's
but somewhat in this direction.
Because you see all these sort of small, like I mean, what would be like a West Village publication or something back in the 70s, right? Like, but you see them on the right wing now emerging all over the place, being like the more interesting places for like poetry.
You should just take, like, instead of Vogue, the same font but call it like Volk.
Nice, man.
But there's one more point on this, like in terms of like how you, like what you describe now, Michael, like you would want to do something entrepreneurial with regards to geared towards women, or travel around across the country and find a group of comedians or autodidacts. But I'm getting back to your point when we talked about like the 1970s, because you do bring up, and I think this is a point you reiterate from Peter Thiel as well, that like up until the 1970s, like 71 thereabouts, the median wages have sort of kept on par with the productivity increases. They went hand in hand.
Right.
But then they become stagnant. So like the technological process is still that you're doing more with less, but it doesn't end up affecting the paychecks of people. And I think the fact that we now in Europe have sort of the MAGA equivalent, like the mega, make Europe great again, sort of speaks to this point. You see, it's an even better term than MAGA, right?
I know.
It's not. Like, it's like the uber federalist point, like make Europe great again. Like let's get Turkey in. Let's
who thought that the sick man of Europe would be Europe? Anyway, but to the point of the median wages, that this is really like the basis for the populism, like the previous, like the Swedish Social Democratic Project, or whatever you want to call it. It drew its political legitimacy from basically achieving this goal, and tried like dead hard to make this work up until the very point it absolutely didn't, and in the process, I think, led to the kind of confusion that the entire Swedish society and perhaps other parts of the progressive camps of the Western world are part of. That the first progressives were very much real politicians, whereas their children and their grandchildren end up drinking the Kool-Aid, becoming cargo cult people, and basically delving down into this, if we're going to draw Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, from cynical nihilism into naive nihilism. They believe fervently in things that have no value anymore and never did. But at least their grandparents could sort of keep two thoughts in their head at the same time, to borrow from 1984 and Orwell here, to make ends meet, essentially. And Sweden was the master in doing these things, or Swedish social democracy. But now we're at this stage when you have some sort of populist backlash with regards to the median wages. And sorry for being like a vulgar Marxist in this, but I don't see so far any large-scale attempt by the now rising tech monarchs that really speaks to this group, but are still very much part of like their aspirations. I mean, they are heroes for many of the working class.
That's fair. I think maybe maybe this is where my strongest libertarian streak comes out, is I think we have to put a stake in the heart of public schooling. And what that means to me is like abolish it. Because I think in order for middle class and upper lower class people to find these on-ramps into worthwhile work, they need to start early. They need to learn on the job. They're not going to obtain these skills in a classroom where they're told to sit still for 7 hours a day. And what that means is, the future of education is going to look very different, even for people in the trades, where they should be leaving what we see as a schoolhouse, something like that.
More vocational is what.
Yeah, exactly. In the U.S., maybe Europe is better at this in some senses. Like, we just denigrate the trades and vocational training. So it's like, if you choose to go down that path, you're just seen as a dunce and less than full citizen in some sense, which is just awful. So I think we should valorize the trades. I think we should let people splinter off and establish themselves in apprenticeships earlier. And I think that could go a long way. But then it's also, we haven't, because we've had socialist education for so long, we haven't seen innovation. It's like, with the techniques for teaching and learning haven't had a 50, 100-year development. And who knows what could happen if people were allowed to experiment and do different things. We just don't know, because it's all been so homogenous. So I agree, like, OpenAI isn't going to bring jobs to Ohio. And that is a problem given the current institutional and legal arrangement. But I think, and to go back to the true Scotsman, in a true libertarian society, I think we'd see more dynamism in the education, in the trades, and in other aspects of life that would help lower income earners. And then we'd also have to get rid of certain labor law, like the minimum wage. It's like, we need people to be able to get these jobs early, so that they get at lower pay, so that they can train up and get raises. The anti-discrimination stuff is problematic. You just make it harder and harder for people to get hired. I don't know. I could keep going on standard policy stuff, but I agree with you. As I wish there was a greater concern for the median wage in Silicon Valley than there is.
But I think this is the sort of reversed problem in the social democratic Europe, where sort of we live most of our lives, because here we sort of have this, we broached on the topic of Europors before, and I think this is the thing where people, sort of the politicians here, instead of just sort of have perfected the skill of managing the kind, and they're sort of telling people that, well, you might, we have to get immigration from abroad because we have to have somebody to take care of you when you get sick. And you hear that in the UK, you hear that in Sweden, where people are people are coming, are really, they're really doctors and nurses and whatnot. And of course, they're not the people, taxing the system in that sense. And I think this is the sort of major difference between our country and yours. That sort of US was always sort of had a sort of, the problem with implementing full socialism in the US was always immigration, and the fact that people needed jobs, and people, business sort of colluded in this, and it's been used by national conservatives, against the libertarian wing of the Republican Party for a long time, that open border policy is, but sort of, obviously has led to the decline of, it's one of the things, offshoring and immigration are the things driven down the wages of American workers. But it's the same thing in Sweden. And I mean, in the 90s, there used to be this major case of Lithuanian workers. You can't, I mean, it sounds benign now, but back in the 90s, Lithuanian workers working in construction in Sweden, it was like you had people from the Social Democratic Party shouting, this was on tape, "Go home." Wow. Because they were working without work permits on this construction site and didn't follow Swedish labor law. And now we have Bangladeshis running around doing DoorDash. Right. And I'm basically 100 meters from their headquarters in Stockholm. This is the sort of space we've traveled in 2030.
Well, you mentioned Brave New World, 1984, another dystopian novel that I think is underrated, but should be included in anyone's top 5 is The Children of Men by PDG.
100%. Thank you.
Amazing. And also an amazing movie with Clive Owen.
Yeah. What I love about the novel, though, is it gets into this issue more where I forget what they're called, sojourners or someone. It's like they have to import all these people from 4 countries to act as service labor in the UK, and they're treated poorly and so on. A tremendous novel and very prescient now, given the I don't know, the unwillingness of people to have children in a dangerous world.
But look, Michael, sorry, Carly, do you want to jump in here, or?
No, I'm just going to say this is the book people should have been reading instead of reading A Handmaid's Tale, which basically is like this sort of weird Bush era conspiracy thing. This is the more this is obviously the better book, but it's the more interesting scenario as well, right?
Yes, but I think also coming to the, I guess this can be a spoiler podcast. Coming to the end of that book, when sort of this whole, like, I don't think it's what it's called, but basically the protector of the realm approach, where he's like the protagonist sort of just finds themselves in a position of power. Then okay, now it befalls to me to fix the situation. I think coming to a close in our conversation. What does that scenario look like? Because you're building these institutions, and by showing how far-reaching that means in cultural terms, I think like by institution we're also changing part of like our understanding of where we actually are in history. And you're working with people like Thiel and others who are also amassing enough resources to actually make a difference in terms of the powers that be. So. What would it look like to actually just find yourself to be in a position where you are the protector of the realm?
The ending of that
Very
novel
compelling.
is ambiguous, I think, and it's not in the movie.
So is your answer.
Yeah. Well, what I mean by that is, I forget the character's name, but will he be tempted by the dark side? He's been given this power. Will he just, is it new boss, same as the old boss kind of thing? But in the case of like, it just feels like I'm so far from power that it'd be hard to conceive what I would do if I had it. But I think in the end, I would start with like really boring policy changes. It would be like, hey, we got to let people build in American cities. And, to go back to caring about middle income earners, it's like, well, they can't afford to live places because we prohibited, cheap housing. So it's like, little things like that could go a long way, I believe, without, pointing to more dramatic policy changes. Some of my more far-flung ideas would be like, city-state charter city type things, experiments. Maybe that would be a way to perform an end around the establishment institutions that could be, if there was a charter city in the United States, that would be extraordinary and kind of wild.
It's like Hong Kong used to be in China back in the old days, or maybe Shanghai Special Economic Zone or something like that, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, well, it's. I think we would sort of end on the subject of becoming sort of medieval again, in the sense that we're talking about city-states and charter cities.
The Bitcoin monastery. That's also an option, I guess, in the future.
Yeah.
No, but also monastery in the sense, like, I think what you get at is, I might have been interpreting or projecting too much into your response, but the fact that the question is, what does your life look like if you follow these ideas? And it's essentially our generation where people have thought of, well, I want to be the epitome of my political ideas, and it turns out that I have a career and my body can no longer bear children, or I have ideas that are completely incompatible with recognizing the strengths of the partners I would have in my life, because I somehow think that the world should be organized.
Or I just live with a hollow hedonism.
Exactly.
And no sense of culture that will continue beyond me, because me and my friends will all just disappear from the earth.
Exactly. And then to also one more point of criticism then of how this whole Protestantism is false. Even Marxism is a fault of Protestantism. Is how it's like it's a religion of the head. And what I read into your response, Michael, is that you want the religion now of the entire body.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, that's well said.
Finally, you say something succinct, Johan. I mean, I'm also shocked. Thank you.
Well, cool, guys. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed the.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, Michael. It was illuminating.
Would love to come to Sweden one day.
Please do. Please do.